You watch colleagues with less talent and experience rise to positions of power while your superior skills go unrecognized. Every strategic move you make seems to backfire, while others effortlessly maneuver themselves into dominant positions, leaving you wondering if there's some invisible game being played that you don't understand. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist who mastered the art of domination without destruction, whose principles have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years. What I discovered about strategic domination will transform how you approach every competitive situation in your life, giving you the secret to winning before your opponents even realize they're in a contest. The battlefield may have changed from ancient China to modern boardrooms and social hierarchies, but the fundamental principles of strategic domination remain as powerful today as they were when I first developed them. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom that conquers modern challenges, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of strategic domination. When I hold this ancient war room map in my hands, I remember the exact moment everything changed for me. I was barely 25, serving as a junior advisor in the court of the Wu Kingdom. Like you, I watched men with less wisdom and fewer capabilities rise to positions of influence, while my insights went unheard. The map before me showed troop positions from my first major campaign, but what it truly represents is the day I learned to see the invisible forces that determine victory and defeat. I had spent months studying traditional military tactics, memorizing formations and siege techniques, believing that mastery of these surface elements would bring me success. I was wrong. The awakening came during a heated council meeting where seasoned generals debated whether to attack an enemy fortress head-on. I sat in silence, studying not just the enemy's defenses, but the dynamics playing out in our own war room. I noticed how the loudest general dominated the conversation, how the king's attention shifted based on emotional appeals rather than strategic merit, how personal rivalries influenced military decisions more than battlefield realities. That night, I walked the palace corridors and observed the informal conversations, the whispered alliances, the subtle power exchanges that occurred between official meetings. I realized I had been blind to the most important battlefield of all, the human dynamics that shaped every decision before a single sword was drawn. The next morning, I approached the king differently. Instead of presenting dry tactical analysis, I spoke to his deepest fears about the campaign and his desire to be remembered as a decisive leader. I positioned my strategy not as the best military option, but as the path that would secure his legacy while minimizing risk to his reputation. Within an hour, my plan was adopted. This was my first glimpse into what I would later call strategic domination, the ability to win through understanding the invisible patterns that govern human behavior and competitive dynamics. Most people see only the surface of any contest, the obvious opponents, the apparent obstacles, the visible metrics of success. They exhaust themselves fighting battles that were lost before they began, because they never learned to see the deeper game being played. I spent the following years developing this sight, this ability to perceive the strategic landscape that exists beneath every competitive situation. I studied how power really moved through organizations, how decisions were truly made, how influence was built and wielded. I learned that in every contest, whether military, political, or personal, there are always two levels of competition, happening simultaneously. The first level is what everyone sees, the formal structures, the official rules, the apparent competitors. This is where most people focus their energy, and where most people lose. The second level is invisible, but infinitely more powerful. The psychological dynamics, the relationship networks, the timing of opportunities, the subtle positioning that makes victory inevitable. Once you develop strategic sight, you begin to see these patterns everywhere. You notice how certain people always seem to be in the right place at the right time, how some individuals can influence decisions without apparent authority, how timing and positioning often matter more than talent or effort. This awakening transformed not just my military career, but my entire approach to life. I realized that strategic domination wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about understanding the game that others couldn't even see. This scroll of self-knowledge sits before me, yellowed with age, but still bearing the brutal assessments I wrote about myself before every campaign. The ink may have faded, but the lesson it represents remains as sharp as the day I nearly lost. Everything because I failed to follow my own principle. It was during the siege of Chu, my third major campaign as a general. I had won 2 decisive victories and felt invincible. The enemy fortress looked weak, my army was confident, and I believed my reputation alone would carry the day. I bypassed my usual practice of systematic self-assessment and ordered an immediate assault. The attack was a disaster. My overconfidence had blinded me to the limitations of my supply lines, the fatigue of my troops, and my own emotional investment in maintaining my winning streak. What I thought was decisive leadership was actually reckless pride. I lost 1/3 of my forces in 2 days and nearly destroyed my career before it truly began. That night, as I sat among the wounded and dying, I created this assessment protocol that would serve me for the rest of my life. I realized that knowing yourself isn't about recognizing your obvious strengths and weaknesses. It's about understanding the deeper patterns of how you think, react, and make decisions under pressure. The scroll contains 4 levels of self-knowledge that I developed through painful experience. First, your tactical capabilities, what you can actually do versus what you think you can do. Most people dramatically overestimate their abilities while underestimating the effort required for execution. I learned to test my assumptions through small experiments before committing to major strategies. Second, your emotional triggers. What situations cause you to abandon rational thinking? I discovered that my desire to maintain my reputation often led me to take unnecessary risks. Once I acknowledged this pattern, I could plan around it. I learned to recognize when my emotions were driving decisions and developed systems to pause and reassess. Third, your resource realities, not just what you have, but what you can sustain over time. Early in my career, I planned strategies based on peak performance, assuming I could maintain maximum effort indefinitely. This led to burnout and strategic failures. True strategic thinking requires honest assessment of your sustainable capabilities. Fourth, your decision-making patterns under stress. I noticed that under pressure, I tended to default to aggressive action, even when patience would serve me better. By understanding this tendency, I could force myself to consider defensive or waiting strategies that my natural instincts would reject. The process of self-assessment became a daily discipline. Each morning, I would spend time honestly evaluating my current state, my motivations, and my capacity for the day ahead. This wasn't self-criticism. It was strategic intelligence gathering about my most important asset, myself. I learned that self-deception is the fastest path to strategic defeat. The moment you begin believing your own propaganda, you lose the ability to make clear decisions. Your enemies will exploit your blind spots, but only if you have them. By knowing yourself completely, you eliminate the vulnerabilities that others can use against you. This practice extends beyond military campaigns to every area of strategic competition. Before entering any contest, you must conduct a brutally honest inventory of your actual position. What advantages do you really possess? What resources can you truly access? What are your genuine motivations, and how might they cloud your judgment? Most people skip this step because it's uncomfortable. It requires admitting limitations and confronting weaknesses. But this discomfort is precisely why the practice gives you strategic advantage. While others operate on wishful thinking and self-flattery, you operate on accurate intelligence about your true capabilities. The irony is that this honest self-assessment actually increases your confidence. When you know exactly what you can and cannot do, you can commit fully to strategies within your capabilities while avoiding those that exceed them. This focused commitment often defeats more talented opponents who scatter their energy across unrealistic objectives. This silk map spread before me shows the intelligence network I built across ancient China, a web of merchants, servants, scholars, and soldiers who became my eyes and ears in every major city. But the true lesson isn't about gathering information. It's about understanding that your real competition isn't always who you think it is. The siege that taught me this principle lasted only 3 days, though I had prepared for 3 months. The enemy commander had a reputation for being impulsive and aggressive, so I built my entire strategy around weathering his initial assault and then counterattacking when his forces were exhausted. I positioned my troops defensively, stockpiled supplies for a long siege, and waited for his predictable attack. It never came. On the third morning, I watched in stunned silence as the enemy forces simply melted away during the night. The commander I thought I knew, the one described in every report, had shown patience and strategic thinking that completely contradicted his reputation. Worse, while I was focused on this supposed threat, a rival general in my own kingdom had convinced the king that my defensive strategy showed weakness and should be replaced with his more aggressive approach. I realized I had been fighting the wrong enemy entirely. The real threat wasn't the opposing commander, but the political dynamics within my own ranks. I had gathered extensive intelligence about external enemies while remaining blind to internal competition. This failure taught me the 3 levels of knowing your competition that became central to my strategic philosophy. The first level is surface knowledge, what people say they want, how they appear to behave, their obvious strengths and weaknesses. This is where most people stop, and it's exactly where I had stopped. Surface knowledge is often deliberately misleading because smart competitors understand that controlling your perception of them is a strategic advantage. The second level is motivational intelligence, understanding what actually drives your competitors' decisions. People rarely do what they say they'll do. They do what their deeper motivations compel them to do. That enemy commander's real motivation wasn't military glory. It was preserving his forces for a larger political struggle. Once I understood this, his withdrawal made perfect sense. The third level is pattern recognition, understanding how people typically respond to different types of pressure and opportunity. Everyone has behavioral patterns that persist across different situations. By studying these patterns, you can predict responses even in novel circumstances. That rival general in my own ranks had a consistent pattern of undermining colleagues when he sensed vulnerability, information I could have used if I had been paying attention. Building my intelligence network became an art form. I learned that the best sources weren't spies or infiltrators, but people who naturally occupied positions where information flowed. Merchants who traded with multiple kingdoms, servants who overheard private conversations, scholars who moved between different courts. These people didn't think of themselves as intelligence assets. They were simply sharing information with someone who listened carefully. The key insight was that people reveal their true intentions through small actions, rather than grand declarations. How someone treats subordinates reveals more about their character than how they behave toward superiors. How they respond to minor setbacks indicates how they'll handle major crises. How they use information they think is private shows their true values and motivations. I developed specific techniques for gathering this deeper intelligence. I learned to ask indirect questions that revealed thinking patterns without seeming intrusive. I studied what people chose to talk about spontaneously, what topics they avoided, how their body language changed with different subjects. I paid attention to their alliances and enemies, their fears and ambitions, their resources and constraints. Most importantly, I learned to distinguish between competitors and enemies. Competitors share your objectives and compete for the same resources, but they operate within similar value systems. Enemies want to destroy not just your current position, but your ability to compete in the future. Understanding this distinction is crucial because the strategies for dealing with each are completely different. The network shown on this map gave me strategic advantages that my enemies could never understand. While they focused on military preparations, I knew their supply situations, their internal politics, their backup plans, and their personal motivations. This intelligence allowed me to win conflicts before they became battles, often by addressing underlying issues rather than fighting symptoms. This battle standard before me once flew atop the highest peak overlooking the valley of Yanmen, where I learned that position determines outcome before the first arrow is fired. The fabric is weathered now, but it represents the moment I discovered. My most powerful principle, supreme excellence, consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. The campaign began with what appeared to be an impossible situation. My army of 12,000 faced an enemy force of nearly 30,000, led by a general whose reputation for tactical brilliance was legendary. Every advisor counseled retreat or negotiation. Traditional military thinking suggested we were facing certain defeat. But I had spent weeks studying the terrain and the political situation. While my enemies focused on troop numbers and weapons, I saw something they missed entirely. The enemy's supply lines ran through territory controlled by local warlords who had no real loyalty to either side. Their army was positioned in a valley that offered excellent defensive advantages, but was strategically vulnerable to isolation. Instead of attacking their strength, I positioned my forces to control the high ground around their supply routes. I sent envoys to the local warlords, not to request alliance, but to offer them exclusive trading rights with my kingdom in exchange for simply remaining neutral. I positioned small mobile units to threaten enemy communications without engaging. In major battles, within 2 weeks, the enemy's superior force began to fragment. Their supplies became unreliable, their communications were disrupted, and their local support evaporated. The legendary general found himself commanding a powerful army that was slowly starving and increasingly isolated. He had won every tactical engagement, but his strategic position had become untenable. The surrender came without a major battle. His army was intact, his reputation preserved, but his mission impossible to complete. By controlling the strategic environment rather than engaging directly, I had made his strength irrelevant. This taught me that positioning is about controlling the conditions under which competition takes place. I developed 3 types of strategic positioning that apply to any competitive situation. Physical positioning involves controlling the tangible elements that influence outcomes: resources, geography, timing, and access. In that Valley campaign, I controlled the physical elements that determined whether his army could function effectively. Psychological positioning involves shaping how others perceive the competitive landscape. People make decisions based on their understanding of the situation, so controlling that understanding gives you tremendous influence over their choices. I positioned myself as the reasonable alternative to the local warlords, making neutrality seem like wisdom rather than weakness. Temporal positioning involves controlling the timing and sequence of events. Most people react to situations as they arise, but strategic positioning allows you to influence when and how situations develop. By creating pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, I force the enemy to make decisions on my timeline rather than theirs. The key insight is that most people position themselves reactively. They wait to see what opportunities arise, then compete for them along with everyone else. Strategic positioning means creating the opportunities you want and structuring situations so that others are competing on your terms. This requires thinking several moves ahead and understanding the interconnected nature of competitive dynamics. Every position you take influences what positions others can take. Every advantage you claim denies certain options to your competitors. Strategic positioning is like chess played across multiple boards simultaneously. The modern application extends far beyond military campaigns. In any organization, the people who advance aren't necessarily the most talented. They're often the ones who position themselves where their talents are most visible and valuable. They align themselves with influential mentors, involve themselves in high-visibility projects, and place themselves at the intersection of important information flows. Strategic positioning requires patience because the best positions often take time to develop. You must be willing to appear passive while building invisible advantages. You must resist the temptation to engage in obvious competition while you're maneuvering for superior position. The ultimate goal is to reach a position where victory becomes inevitable without needing to demonstrate superior force. When you achieve proper strategic positioning, competitors either choose not to compete or find themselves competing under conditions that favor you completely. This is how you win before the battle begins. This smooth river stone rests in my palm, worn to perfection by countless years of patient water flow. I keep it as a reminder of the lesson that transformed my understanding of power itself, that the softest force in nature consistently overcomes the hardest materials through perfect timing and persistence. The lesson came during what my officers called the 3-month stalemate at the fortress of Jing. The enemy had retreated behind walls that were considered impregnable, and my advisors pressed for immediate assault. Every day of delay cost us resources and gave our enemies time to call for reinforcements. The logical choice was swift, decisive action, but I had been studying the seasonal patterns of the region. I noticed that the spring rains, still 2 months away, would swell the river that ran beside the fortress. More importantly, I had learned that the fortress's foundation included an ancient drainage system that had been partially blocked over the decades. The combination of these factors would create a vulnerability that didn't exist during any other season. My generals thought I had lost my nerve. For 3 months, we maintained siege conditions while I appeared to do nothing. I used this time to gather intelligence, strengthen supply lines, and position backup forces. Most critically, I prepared my army for the specific type of rapid assault that would be possible when the moment arrived. When the spring floods came, they created exactly the conditions I had anticipated. The blocked drainage system caused water to undermine a section of the fortress wall. What had been an impregnable defense became a strategic weakness in a matter of days. The assault we launched succeeded in hours, not months, because we struck. At the moment when all conditions favored us, this experience taught me that timing isn't about speed, it's about alignment. The most powerful action in the world is useless if taken at the wrong moment. Conversely, modest effort applied at the perfect moment can produce extraordinary results. Understanding this principle transforms how you approach every competitive situation. I learned to recognize 3 types of timing that govern strategic success. Natural timing follows the inherent rhythms of systems and situations. Just as farmers plant according to seasons, strategic leaders must align their actions with the natural cycles of their environment. Organizations have rhythms, markets have cycles, and people have patterns of receptivity. Manufactured timing involves creating the conditions that make your preferred moment more likely to arrive. Rather than waiting passively for opportunities, you can influence when and how they emerge. I often created small crises or opportunities that forced situations to develop on timelines that favored my position. Responsive timing means recognizing and acting on moments as they arise naturally. This requires constant awareness and the ability to shift quickly when conditions change. The most prepared strategy is worthless if you miss the window for implementation. The critical insight is that premature action destroys more strategies than enemy action. When you move too early, you alert competitors to your intentions, exhaust resources before the crucial moment, and often face resistance that wouldn't exist if you waited. Patience isn't passive, it's active preparation for the right moment. I developed specific practices for cultivating strategic patience. I learned to distinguish between urgent feelings and actual urgency. Most pressure to act immediately comes from internal anxiety rather than external necessity. By understanding your own psychological patterns, you can avoid making decisions based on discomfort rather than strategic logic. I also learned to prepare multiple response options so that when the right moment arrived, I could act swiftly and decisively. Patience doesn't mean being unprepared. It means being so prepared that you can afford to wait for optimal conditions. The way of water teaches us that persistent pressure applied consistently over time can reshape the hardest obstacles. Small, continuous efforts often prove more effective than massive, sporadic ones. This principle applies whether you're building relationships, developing skills, or implementing long-term strategies. Modern application of timing principles can transform careers and competitive outcomes. Instead of forcing opportunities, you learn to position yourself where opportunities naturally emerge and prepare so thoroughly that you can capitalize instantly when conditions align. This theatrical mask with its multiple expressions sits before me, a reminder of the most counterintuitive lesson I ever learned. The most powerful form of deception is revealing a carefully chosen truth that exposes your opponent's deepest intentions. What appears to be weakness can become your greatest strength when used with strategic precision. The campaign that taught me this principle began with what seemed like my greatest disadvantage. I was facing General Li Wei, whose army outnumbered mine 3-1 and whose reputation for aggressive tactics was legendary throughout the region. Every strategic manual suggested that facing such overwhelming force required defensive positioning and guerrilla tactics. Instead, I chose to appear even weaker than I actually was. I deliberately positioned my army in what appeared to be a vulnerable formation, with obvious gaps in our defenses and supply lines that seemed poorly protected. I sent messages through channels I knew were compromised, discussing our food shortages and low morale. I even staged arguments among my officers where enemy spies could observe them, creating the impression of internal division. General Li Wei took the bait exactly as I hoped. His aggressive nature, combined with the apparent opportunity, caused him to abandon his usual caution. He divided his superior forces to attack what he perceived as multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. This decision revealed everything I needed to know about his decision-making process, his confidence level, and his strategic priorities. When he committed to his multi-pronged attack, I was ready. The gaps in my defenses were carefully prepared killing zones. The divided officers executed coordinated maneuvers that had been rehearsed extensively. The vulnerable supply lines were protected by hidden reserves. His overwhelming numerical advantage became a liability as his scattered forces found themselves engaging a concentrated, prepared enemy on ground of my choosing. This experience taught me that strategic deception isn't about lying, it's about controlling what truths your opponents choose to focus on. Every situation contains multiple realities. By emphasizing certain true elements while downplaying others, you can guide competitors toward interpretations that serve your strategic purposes. I learned to distinguish between manipulative deception and strategic positioning. Manipulation involves creating false impressions for short-term advantage, but strategic deception involves authentic positioning that reveals opponents' tendencies while concealing your full capabilities. The difference is crucial both ethically and practically. The principle I developed states, when capable, feign incapability. When active, appear inactive. When near, appear far. When far, appear near. This isn't about dishonesty, it's about understanding that people's perceptions drive their decisions more than objective reality does. Controlled vulnerability serves multiple strategic purposes. First, it draws out aggressive competitors who reveal their true intentions when they think they see weakness. Second, it causes others to underestimate your capabilities, giving you the element of surprise. Third, it positions you as a non-threat, reducing the likelihood that stronger competitors will target you preemptively. The key is ensuring that your apparent weakness is actually a concealed strength. True strategic deception requires enormous confidence and preparation because you must be genuinely strong enough to handle whatever response your positioning provokes. You're not actually vulnerable. You're appearing vulnerable in areas where you're secretly prepared. I developed specific techniques for implementing this principle. I learned to identify which aspects of my position I could afford to reveal and which required concealment. I practiced projecting specific emotions and attitudes that would provoke predictable responses from different personality types. I studied how to time these revelations for maximum strategic impact. The psychological foundation of this approach rests on understanding that most people see what they want to see. Aggressive competitors look for weakness to exploit. Defensive competitors look for threats to avoid. By understanding these tendencies, you can position yourself to trigger the responses that best serve your strategic objectives. Modern applications of this principle appear throughout competitive environments. The most successful negotiations often begin with apparent concessions that actually guide opponents toward conclusions you prefer. The strongest leaders sometimes display carefully chosen vulnerabilities that build trust and encourage others to reveal their true positions. The ultimate goal isn't to deceive others about who you are, but to control when and how you reveal your full capabilities. This allows you to gather intelligence about competitors' intentions while maintaining maximum flexibility in your own strategic responses. This imperial seal weighs heavy in my hand, its carved jade surface worn smooth by years of decisive action. It represents the hardest lesson I learned about leadership, that strategic domination requires absolute clarity of command. But this authority must be earned through vision rather than imposed through force. The lesson came during my most dangerous campaign, when political considerations forced me to share command with General Joe, a court favorite whose primary qualification was his family connections. The arrangement seemed diplomatic. We would make major decisions jointly and coordinate our forces for maximum effectiveness. In reality, it nearly destroyed both our armies and taught me why divided authority is the fastest path to strategic failure. The crisis emerged when we encountered an enemy force in a position where immediate action was essential. I saw an opportunity to divide their attention by striking simultaneously from two directions. But the maneuver required precise timing and total commitment from both our forces. General Joe preferred a more cautious approach that would minimize risk to his reputation. We spent 3 hours in heated debate while the opportunity evaporated. By the time we reached a compromise, the enemy had reinforced their position and our window for decisive action had closed. What followed was a costly, inconclusive engagement that could have been a brilliant victory with unified command. That night, as I surveyed our wounded soldiers and damaged reputation, I realized that strategic authority isn't about rank or title. It's about the ability to make rapid, clear decisions that others can follow with confidence. Divided command creates hesitation, and hesitation in strategic moments is often fatal. I learned to distinguish between autocratic control and unified vision. Autocratic control attempts to manage every detail through force and creates resentment that undermines long-term effectiveness. Unified vision creates a framework where others can make independent decisions that serve the overall strategy without constant supervision. The seal before me represents the authority I eventually earned, but more importantly, It symbolizes the responsibility that comes with strategic leadership. When you accept ultimate authority for outcomes, you must also accept ultimate accountability for failures. This accountability creates clarity that serves everyone involved. I developed specific practices for building unified command without destroying initiative. First, I learned to articulate strategic objectives so clearly that others could understand not just what to do, but why those actions served the larger purpose. When people understand the reasoning behind decisions, they can adapt intelligently when circumstances change. Second, I established decision-making protocols that eliminated confusion during crisis moments. Everyone knew who had authority for different types of decisions and how information should flow during rapidly developing situations. This prevented the paralysis that comes from unclear responsibility. Third, I built trust through consistent demonstration of competence and judgment. Authority that's imposed from above creates compliance, but authority that's earned through results creates commitment. People follow orders from superiors, but they follow vision from leaders they trust. Critical insight is that unified command requires unified vision. If people are working toward different objectives or interpreting success differently, no amount of structural authority can create effective coordination. Strategic leadership means ensuring that everyone understands not just their role, but how their role contributes to the ultimate objective. Modern applications of this principle extend beyond military situations to any context where coordinated action is required. The most effective teams have clear decision-making authority combined with shared understanding of objectives. This allows for rapid response while maintaining strategic coherence. I learned that the best strategic leaders make their authority invisible during normal operations and decisive during crisis moments. When everything is running smoothly, unified command appears as collaborative leadership. When rapid decisions are required, there's no confusion about who has responsibility and authority. The balance requires enormous judgment and self-awareness. You must know when to seek input and when to make unilateral decisions. You must understand when consensus serves the strategy and when it becomes an obstacle to effective action. This war drum sits silent now, but I can still hear its thunderous call that once coordinated the fastest military maneuver of my career. The sound could carry across impossible distances, allowing me to orchestrate lightning-fast movements that compensated for numerical disadvantage and taught me that speed is often the decisive factor that transforms strategic planning into strategic victory. The campaign that proved this principle began with the worst possible news. 3 enemy armies were converging on our position, and each one individually matched our strength. Traditionals. Strategic thinking suggested that facing combined forces of nearly 10,000 when we had only 3,500 was hopeless. Conventional wisdom recommended retreat or negotiation, but I had studied the timing of their movements and realized that while their combined strength was overwhelming, they would arrive at different times if we could force the engagement. The First Army would reach us in 2 days, the second in 4 days, and the third in 6 days. This created a window where speed could neutralize their numerical advantage. I made a decision that shocked my officers. We would abandon our defensive position and attack the First Army before the others could arrive. More controversially, we would use forced marches to cover twice the normal distance and engage them a full day earlier than they expected. This meant our soldiers would fight immediately after exhausting travel, but it also meant fighting 3,500 against 3,500 instead of 3,500 against 10,000. The drum coordinated movements that seemed impossible to outside observers. We broke camp before dawn, traveled light and fast, and reached the enemy position while they were still establishing their defensive lines. The attack caught them completely unprepared for engagement, and we achieved total victory before they could organize effective resistance. More importantly, this lightning campaign demoralized the other two armies. When they arrived to find their allies defeated and our forces already positioned in strong defensive terrain, they chose to withdraw rather than attack. Speed had transformed a hopeless situation into a decisive, strategic victory. This experience taught me that rapidity is indeed the essence of war, but not for the reasons most people assume. Speed doesn't just provide tactical advantages, it fundamentally alters the strategic landscape by preventing enemies from executing their plans and forcing them to react on your timeline rather than theirs. I learned to distinguish between different types of strategic speed. Decision-making velocity involves the ability to analyze situations and commit to action faster than competitors can respond. This requires preparation, clear criteria for evaluation, and the confidence to act on incomplete information when delay costs more than uncertainty. Execution speed involves moving from decision to implementation faster than others expect. Most strategic advantages erode over time as competitors adapt and circumstances change. The ability to implement rapidly while advantages exist often determines success more than the quality of the strategy itself. Information speed involves gathering and processing intelligence faster than the pace of change in your environment. In rapidly evolving situations, the side with more current information has enormous advantages in decision-making and positioning. The key insight is that speed disrupts enemy preparation and decision-making. When you act faster than opponents expect, they must respond with incomplete planning and inadequate positioning. This forces them into reactive rather than proactive strategic postures, which inherently disadvantages them. However, speed without direction is simply chaos. Strategic speed requires knowing exactly what you want to accomplish and having prepared the capabilities to execute rapidly when opportunities arise. The lightning strike works because the preparation is thorough. Even though the execution is swift, I developed specific practices for maintaining strategic velocity. I learned to make rapid decisions by establishing clear criteria in advance then analyzing every situation from scratch. I prepared multiple contingency plans so that when circumstances changed, implementation could begin immediately. Modern applications of speed principles can transform competitive outcomes in any field. Markets reward rapid response to opportunities. Organizations advance people who can execute quickly without sacrificing quality. Negotiations favor those who can process information and adjust positions faster than the pace of discussion. The ultimate goal is achieving what I called strategic momentum, the ability to maintain initiative and force competitors to respond to your actions rather than pursuing their own strategies. When you control the pace of competition, you control the conditions under which others must operate. This ceremonial jade piece once sealed the most important alliance of my career, transforming my greatest enemy into my most valuable partner and teaching me that strategic relationships can multiply individual power far beyond what pure talent or effort can achieve alone. The situation seemed impossible when it began. General Feng commanded the most disciplined army in the region and controlled territory that blocked my access to crucial supply routes. For 2 years, we had been locked in a costly stalemate that was draining both our resources and weakening us against other regional threats. Traditional thinking suggested that one of us had to destroy the other to achieve strategic objectives. But I had been studying General Feng's broader strategic position and realized that we faced a common threat neither of us could handle alone. The northern kingdoms were building a coalition that would eventually overwhelm any individual southern commander, regardless of their tactical skill. By continuing our conflict, we were essentially guaranteeing our mutual defeat at the hands of a more organized enemy. The challenge was approaching someone who had been trying to kill me for 2 years with a proposal for partnership. Any direct overture would be seen as weakness or deception. Instead, I began with small gestures that demonstrated mutual benefit without requiring trust or commitment. I started by deliberately allowing his supply convoys to pass through contested territory unmolested, while ensuring he knew I had chosen not to attack rather than missed opportunities. I shared intelligence about northern troop movements that affected his territory, proving the information's value through subsequent events. I coordinated my military movements to create pressure on his other enemies while avoiding direct engagement. With his forces, these actions established a pattern of behavior that served his interests while advancing mine. More importantly, they demonstrated that cooperation was possible without either of us appearing weak or surrendering strategic autonomy. Over months, these small collaborations built a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. The formally alliance came when the northern threat became too obvious to ignore. General Feng approached me with a proposal for coordinated defense, but I was ready with a more comprehensive partnership that addressed both immediate threats and long-term strategic objectives. The Jade Peace sealed an agreement that made both our armies more effective than they had ever been separately. This experience taught me that the strongest alliances aren't based on friendship or shared values. They're built on aligned incentives and complementary capabilities. People don't need to like each other to work together effectively, but they must benefit more from cooperation than from competition. I learned to identify 3 types of strategic relationships that serve different purposes. Tactical alliances address immediate specific challenges and typically dissolve when those challenges are resolved. These require minimal trust but offer limited scope for collaboration. Strategic partnerships involve ongoing cooperation around shared objectives and complementary strengths. These require more trust and communication but offer greater potential for mutual advantage. The relationship with General Feng evolved into this type of partnership. Transformational alliances create new capabilities that neither party could develop independently. These require the highest levels of trust and coordination, but can fundamentally alter competitive landscapes. The most powerful leaders actively seek to create these relationships. The key insight is that most people approach relationships reactively. They respond to overtures from others or form alliances based on convenience and similarity. Strategic alliance building means proactively identifying whose success would serve your objectives and systematically building relationships that serve mutual interests. This requires thinking beyond immediate transactions to understand how potential partners fit into larger strategic pictures. The best alliances solve multiple problems simultaneously and create compound benefits that grow over time. I developed specific criteria for evaluating potential strategic partners. They must possess capabilities that complement rather than duplicate your own strengths. They must face challenges that your capabilities can help address. Most importantly, their success must genuinely advance your strategic objectives rather than merely avoiding conflict. Modern applications of alliance principles can accelerate career advancement and competitive success. The most successful people aren't necessarily the most talented individually. They're often the most skilled at building relationships that multiply their individual capabilities. Strategic networking isn't about collecting contacts. It's about identifying people whose success would serve your objectives and systematically building relationships that create mutual value. This approach transforms networking from social activity into strategic capability. This bamboo scroll bends in my hands without breaking, its flexibility preserved through countless years, just as it was when it saved my career and taught me that rigid adherence to plans, no matter how brilliant, often leads to devastating failure. True strategic mastery requires the ability to adapt without abandoning your core principles. The lesson came during what should have been my most straightforward victory. I had spent months developing an elaborate strategy to capture the fortress of May, involving coordinated attacks from 3 directions, precise timing of supply disruptions, and psychological warfare designed to demoralize the defenders. Every detail had been planned meticulously, every contingency considered, every element rehearsed to perfection. The plan was brilliant, and it would have worked flawlessly if the enemy had cooperated with my assumptions. 3 days before the coordinated assault was scheduled to begin, my scouts reported that the fortress had been reinforced with twice the expected number of defenders and equipped with new defensive weapons I hadn't anticipated. Worse, my planned approach routes had been fortified with obstacles that would make the coordinated timing impossible. My officers expected me to postpone the attack and develop a new strategy. Every principle of military planning suggested that attempting to execute a plan under dramatically different conditions was foolish. But I had also learned that opportunities rarely wait for perfect preparation, and delay would give the enemy time to strengthen their position further. Instead of abandoning the operation or rigidly following the original plan, I kept the core objective while completely reimagining the approach. Within 6 hours, I had restructured the entire campaign around the new intelligence. Rather than 3 coordinated attacks, we would use a single, concentrated assault preceded by intensive psychological warfare designed to exploit the defenders' overconfidence in their new fortifications. The adapted strategy succeeded beyond my original expectations. The defenders, expecting the complex attack they had prepared to counter, were caught completely unprepared for the direct, intense assault we actually delivered. Their sophisticated defensive preparations became liabilities when faced with an approach they hadn't anticipated. This experience taught me the crucial difference between strategic flexibility and strategic confusion. Flexibility means maintaining clear objectives while adapting methods to changing circumstances. Confusion means changing objectives whenever methods become difficult. I learned that successful adaptation requires what I call bamboo thinking, the ability to bend under pressure without breaking your essential structure. Bamboo survives storms that destroy rigid trees because it yields to forces it cannot resist, while maintaining its roots and core integrity. Strategic adaptation operates on 3 levels that must work together. Tactical adaptation involves adjusting specific methods and techniques based on immediate circumstances. This is the most obvious form of flexibility and what most people think of as adaptation. Operational adaptation involves restructuring larger approaches and resource allocation based on changing conditions. This requires more significant adjustments, but maintains the same basic strategic direction. Strategic adaptation involves changing fundamental approaches while preserving core objectives. This is the most challenging form of adaptation because it requires questioning basic assumptions while maintaining strategic coherence. The key insight is that adaptation without anchor points becomes drift, while rigidity without flexibility becomes brittleness. The most effective strategic leaders develop strong core principles that remain constant while building enormous flexibility in how those principles are applied. I developed specific practices for maintaining adaptive capability. I learned to distinguish between elements of plans that were essential to success and elements that were merely convenient or traditional. Essential elements required protection and consistency, while non-essential elements could be modified freely based on circumstances. I also learned to create multiple contingency approaches for every major objective, not because I expected specific problems, but because the process of developing alternatives made me more mentally flexible when unexpected challenges arose. Most importantly, I learned to view setbacks and surprises as intelligence about changing conditions rather than personal failures. When circumstances don't match expectations, the problem is usually with the expectations rather than the circumstances. Modern applications of adaptive thinking can transform how you handle career challenges and competitive situations. The people who advance most rapidly aren't necessarily those with the best initial plans. They're often those who can adjust most effectively when conditions change while maintaining focus on their ultimate objectives. The goal isn't to abandon planning, but to hold plans lightly enough that you can modify them when reality provides better information than your assumptions did. This ancient abacus before me, its wooden beads worn smooth by countless calculations, represents the unglamorous but crucial lesson that transformed my understanding of strategic power. Victory belongs not to those with the most resources, but to those who use limited resources most efficiently to achieve maximum strategic impact. The campaign that taught me this principle began with what appeared to be an impossible logistical challenge. I had been ordered to maintain a siege of the walled city of Han for an entire season, but my supply lines stretched across hostile territory, and enemy raiders constantly threatened our provisions. My quartermaster estimated that traditional supply methods would require 3 times our available resources to sustain the operation. Most commanders would have requested additional troops and supplies or argued for abandoning the siege. Instead, I saw this constraint as an opportunity to develop strategic capabilities that would serve me throughout my career. I decided to make resource scarcity a competitive advantage rather than a limiting factor. I began by conducting a complete audit of how we were actually using resources versus how we assumed we were using them. I discovered enormous waste in areas that had never been questioned. Soldiers were discarding equipment that could be repaired. Food was being prepared in ways that created unnecessary waste, and energy was being spent on activities that contributed nothing to our strategic objectives. More importantly, I realized that we were thinking about resources too narrowly. Instead of viewing supplies as things we had to transport and consume, I began seeing the entire environment as a source of strategic assets. The siege itself could become self-sustaining if we approached resource management creatively. I implemented what I called strategic foraging, systematic identification, and utilization of resources that already existed in our operational area. Local materials could replace manufactured supplies. Enemy supply routes could become our supply routes through carefully planned raids. Even psychological resources like enemy morale could be harvested and converted into strategic advantages. Breakthrough came when I realized that our most valuable resource wasn't food or weapons. It was information and positioning. By using our limited supplies to gather intelligence about enemy weaknesses and position ourselves advantageously, we could achieve victory through strategic leverage rather than material overwhelming. Within 2 months, we had not only sustained the siege, but created a supply network that was more reliable than traditional methods. Local populations, initially hostile, became collaborative when they realized that our efficient resource use made us better neighbors than the wasteful garrison we were besieging. The siege succeeded through resource efficiency rather than resource abundance. This experience taught me that scarcity creates strategic advantages that abundance cannot provide. When resources are limited, you're forced to identify what truly matters and eliminate everything that doesn't contribute directly to your objectives. This focus often produces better results than having unlimited resources and no forcing mechanism for prioritization. I developed 3 principles of strategic resource management that apply to any competitive situation. First, efficiency multiplies. Impact. A small force that wastes nothing can often accomplish more than a large force that wastes everything. Most people focus on acquiring more resources rather than optimizing the use of resources they already possess. Second, constraint drives innovation. When you can't solve problems by adding resources, you're forced to find creative solutions that often prove superior to resource-intensive approaches. Some of my most effective strategies emerged from situations where traditional approaches were impossible due to resource limitations. Third, underutilized assets exist everywhere. Most people see only obvious resources and miss the potential value of assets that require creative application. Learning to identify and mobilize hidden resources gives you capabilities that competitors cannot match through conventional means. Learn to distinguish between resource allocation and resource multiplication. Allocation involves distributing limited assets across competing priorities. Multiplication involves using resources in ways that create additional resources or capabilities. The key insight is that strategic thinking transforms resource constraints from limitations into advantages. When you cannot overwhelm problems with resources, you must outthink them, and this mental discipline often produces solutions that remain valuable even when resources become abundant. Modern applications of resource efficiency can accelerate career advancement and competitive success regardless of your starting position. The people who advance most rapidly aren't necessarily those with the most resources. They're often those who achieve the most with whatever resources they can access. This battle lantern casts dancing shadows across the wall, its flickering light creating shapes that seem far more menacing than reality, much like the psychological campaign that won me the Fortress of Qi without losing a single soldier. The lantern reminds me that perception shapes reality more powerfully than facts, and mastering the psychology of competition often matters more than mastering its mechanics. The siege that taught me this principle began with intelligence that should have been devastating. The fortress commander was known for his unshakable courage, his troops were veteran fighters with absolute loyalty, and their defensive position was nearly impregnable. Every conventional approach would result in massive casualties with uncertain outcomes, but I had also learned something interesting about this commander. His greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability. His reputation for personal courage meant that any suggestion of cowardice would be psychologically unbearable. His troops' loyalty was built on their belief in his invincibility. If I could create doubt about his judgment without directly challenging his courage, the entire defensive structure might collapse. I began what appeared to be a conventional siege, but every action was designed for psychological rather than tactical impact. I positioned my forces in ways that created an illusion of overwhelmings. Numbers through clever use of banners, campfires, and troop movements. I staged elaborate preparations for assaults that never came, creating constant anticipation and stress among the defenders. More subtly, I began spreading information through channels I knew would reach the fortress. The information was completely accurate but carefully selected to create specific psychological effects. I shared details about successful sieges at other fortresses, emphasizing how strong positions had fallen to patient, intelligent attackers. I made sure they knew about reinforcements coming to my army while remaining silent about their own potential support. The crucial element was timing these psychological pressures to build cumulative stress rather than triggering immediate reactions. Each piece of information, each demonstration of capability, each day of waiting created additional psychological pressure without providing clear opportunities for the defenders to release that pressure through action. After 6 weeks, the fortress commander sent envoys requesting terms for surrender. His troops remained loyal and capable. His defenses were intact, and no actual assault had been attempted. But the psychological pressure had convinced him that defeat was inevitable, and his reputation for wisdom allowed him to surrender honorably, rather than lead his men to destruction. This experience taught me that psychological warfare isn't about manipulation or cruelty. It's about understanding how people make decisions under pressure and structuring situations so that the decisions you prefer appear to be the most logical and attractive options available. I learned that fear and confidence are strategic weapons, more powerful than any physical force. Fear doesn't just affect morale, it degrades decision-making, disrupts coordination, and creates mistakes that wouldn't occur under normal conditions. Confidence has the opposite effect, improving performance and enabling actions that would seem impossible under different psychological conditions. The key insight is that most competitive situations are decided by psychology long before they're decided by capability. People don't perform at their theoretical maximum. They perform at the level their psychological state allows. By influencing psychological conditions, you can effectively increase your capabilities while decreasing your opponent's functional strength. I developed specific techniques for projecting psychological influence without compromising my ethical standards. Intimidation through displays of competence differs fundamentally from intimidation through threats of harm. Creating respect for your capabilities serves everyone's interests better than creating fear of your intentions. I learned to build psychological momentum that becomes self-reinforcing. Early demonstrations of strategic thinking create expectations of continued excellence. Consistent follow-through on commitments builds reputation for reliability. Measured responses to provocations establish credibility for both reasonableness and strength. The most powerful psychological weapon is controlled unpredictability. When opponents cannot reliably predict your responses, they must prepare for multiple contingencies, which divides their attention and resources. However, this unpredictability must be strategic rather than random. Your responses should follow principles that serve your objectives even when others cannot discern those. Principles, modern applications of psychological strategy, can transform competitive outcomes in any environment. Understanding how psychological pressure affects decision-making allows you to structure negotiations, presentations, and competitive situations to influence outcomes without relying purely on logical arguments or superior resources. The goal isn't to manipulate others unfairly, but to understand that psychology influences every competitive interaction, whether you acknowledge it or not. By developing conscious competence in psychological dynamics, you can ensure that these influences serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. The ultimate psychological victory occurs when opponents choose to support your objectives, because they believe doing so serves their own interests better than opposing you. This creates sustainable competitive advantages that don't require constant enforcement or monitoring. This ornate sword rests in its sheath before me, its blade never drawn in the campaign that secured my greatest territorial gain. The weapon represents the most counterintuitive lesson of my strategic education, that unused power often influences outcomes more dramatically than demonstrated force, and restraint can project strength more effectively than action. The situation that taught me this principle began with what seemed like perfect justification for overwhelming force. A rebellious governor had declared independence from our kingdom, seized our tax collectors, and was openly recruiting soldiers from neighboring regions. Every advisor counseled immediate military response to prevent other provinces from following his example. The governor commanded forces roughly equal to mine, but his position was politically vulnerable, and his support was based more on immediate grievances than long-term loyalty. Traditional strategic thinking suggested that swift, decisive military action would resolve the situation before it could spread to other regions. Instead, I chose to do nothing visible while doing everything invisible. I positioned my army within a day's march of his territory, but made no threatening moves. I sent envoys requesting negotiations about his specific grievances while making no demands for immediate submission. I quietly communicated with his supporters not to subvert his authority, but to understand what they truly wanted from the situation. Most importantly, I made sure that everyone, including the rebellious governor, understood that I possessed overwhelming capability to resolve the situation through force, but was choosing restraint in service of finding better solutions. The sheathed sword became a symbol that everyone could interpret according to their own interests and fears. The psychological effect was extraordinary. The governor's supporters began questioning whether their grievances were worth risking destruction by someone who clearly possessed the power to destroy them but was showing wisdom and patience instead. Neighboring provinces, instead of seeing opportunity in successful rebellion, saw the danger of provoking someone who combined overwhelming capability with measured judgment. Within 2 months, the governor himself requested private negotiations. He had realized that his strongest position was as a loyal but independent-minded provincial leader, rather than as a rebel who had somehow avoided destruction. The eventual agreement gave him most of what he wanted, while securing our strategic objectives, and it was implemented without a single battle. This experience taught me that demonstrated restraint often communicates strength more effectively than demonstrated force. When people know you could act but choose not to, they respect both your capability and your judgment. When they see you using force, they may fear your capability but question your wisdom. I learned that unused options retain more strategic value than used options. Once you commit to a particular action, you lose the psychological advantage of uncertainty and the practical advantage of flexibility. Keeping powerful options available while pursuing other approaches often achieves better outcomes than immediately employing your strongest capabilities. The paradox operates because restraint requires confidence that force cannot fake. Only someone genuinely secure in their position can afford to appear patient and reasonable when provoked. Insecure leaders often feel compelled to demonstrate strength through action, which actually reveals their underlying uncertainty about their true capabilities. I developed specific techniques for projecting strength through restraint that apply beyond military situations. First, I learned to communicate capability through preparation rather than action. When people can see that you're ready for any response they might choose, they tend to choose responses that don't require testing. Your readiness. Second, I learned to set clear boundaries while offering face-saving alternatives. People need to understand exactly what will trigger decisive action while having attractive options that don't require testing those boundaries. This approach gives others maximum incentive to choose cooperation over confrontation. Third, I learned to maintain visible readiness while pursuing collaborative solutions. The goal isn't to appear weak or passive, but to appear so confident in your ultimate capabilities that you can afford to be patient and reasonable while others decide how they want to respond. The key insight is that restraint is only powerful when others believe it's chosen rather than forced. If people think you're being patient because you lack alternatives, restraint becomes weakness. If they believe you're being patient because you're strong enough to afford patience, restraint becomes a demonstration of superior strategic position. Modern applications of this principle can transform competitive relationships and negotiating outcomes. The leaders who inspire the most respect are often those who clearly possess the capability to overwhelm opposition, but consistently choose to find solutions that serve everyone's interests when possible. The ultimate goal is reaching a position where others choose to cooperate because they respect your judgment and capabilities rather than because they fear immediate consequences. This creates sustainable influence that doesn't require constant demonstration or enforcement. This broken arrow shaft lies before me, deliberately preserved from my most humiliating defeat, the battle that nearly ended my career, but ultimately transformed me into the strategist who would never again underestimate the value of failure. As a teacher, the fractured wood reminds me that defeats often provide more valuable strategic intelligence than victories ever can. The disaster occurred during my fourth major campaign, when overconfidence from previous successes led me to make every mistake I now teach others to avoid. I had won 3 consecutive victories and begun believing my own reputation for strategic brilliance. The enemy was led by an unknown commander whose forces were smaller and less experienced than mine. I approached the campaign with arrogance, disguised as confidence, assuming that superior numbers and my established reputation would be sufficient for victory. I neglected detailed intelligence gathering, dismissed the reports of enemy innovation in tactics, and failed to adapt my strategy. to the specific terrain and conditions we would face. The battle itself was a masterpiece of strategic humiliation. The unknown commander had studied my previous victories extensively and designed countermeasures for every tactic I typically employed. My predictable approach to positioning, timing, and resource allocation allowed him to anticipate and neutralize every move I made. Worse, he had prepared psychological warfare specifically targeting my reputation and ego. His forces appeared to retreat at exactly the moments that would encourage me to overextend my position, then struck when my troops were scattered and vulnerable. By the end of the day, I had lost not only the battle, but nearly half my army. The personal cost was devastating. My reputation for invincibility was shattered, my political position was weakened, and my confidence in my own judgment was completely undermined. For weeks, I considered abandoning military leadership entirely, convinced that my previous successes had been luck rather than skill. But this broken arrow became the foundation of my strategic education rather than its conclusion. I realized that the defeat contained more useful information about strategic reality than all my victories combined. Victories had taught me what worked under favorable conditions. Defeat revealed what didn't work under pressure and how enemies could exploit weaknesses I didn't know I possessed. I began a systematic analysis of every element that had contributed to the failure. I studied not just my tactical mistakes, but the psychological and strategic errors that had made those mistakes inevitable. I realized that my previous victories had created blind spots that made future defeats more likely rather than less likely. This process taught me that strategic resilience isn't about avoiding failure. It's about extracting maximum value from failures when they occur and using that intelligence to prevent similar failures in the future. Every defeat contains information about weaknesses, assumptions, and environmental factors that success typically conceals. I learned to distinguish between tactical defeats and strategic failures. Tactical defeats involve losing specific engagements, while maintaining overall strategic position and capability. Strategic failures involve damage to your fundamental ability to compete effectively in the future. Most defeats are tactical if you respond to them strategically. The key insight is that defeats often result from success-induced blindness rather than fundamental incompetence. Victory creates psychological momentum that can lead to overconfidence, while repeated success can create patterns that become predictable to intelligent opponents. Learning to maintain strategic humility during successful periods is crucial for long-term effectiveness. I developed specific practices for learning from setbacks that transformed my approach to strategic development. First, I learned to conduct immediate post-action analysis focused on extracting lessons rather than assigning blame. What environmental factors contributed to the outcome? What assumptions proved incorrect? What enemy capabilities had I underestimated? Second, I learned to identify the systemic issues that made specific mistakes more likely. Individual tactical errors usually reflect broader strategic or psychological patterns that will produce similar problems in different contexts unless addressed directly. Third, I learned to use defeats as opportunities to develop new capabilities and approaches. The constraints and pressures that produce failures often force innovation that wouldn't occur during comfortable success. Modern applications of resilience principles can transform how setbacks affect career advancement and competitive success. The people who achieve sustained excellence aren't those who avoid failure, but those who learn faster and more systematically from failures when they occur. The ultimate goal is developing what I call strategic anti-fragility, the ability to become stronger and more capable as a direct result of facing challenges and setbacks. This requires viewing defeats as intelligence-gathering operations rather than personal catastrophes, and using that intelligence to build competitive advantages. that wouldn't exist without the learning that failure provides. This acorn sits in my palm, seemingly insignificant, yet containing the potential for a mighty oak that will provide shade for generations not yet born. I planted similar seeds throughout my territories, not for my own benefit, but because I had learned that true strategic domination requires thinking beyond immediate victories to create influence that compounds across decades and even centuries. The campaign that taught me this principle began with what appeared to be a minor territorial dispute that could have been resolved quickly through conventional means. A small border province was being contested by two neighboring kingdoms, and both sides requested my military support in exchange for future alliance. Standard strategic thinking suggested choosing the stronger partner for immediate advantage. Instead, I saw an opportunity to create something unprecedented, a sustainable peace that would eliminate the source of conflict rather than simply determining its temporary outcome. This vision required sacrificing immediate gains for long-term strategic positioning that wouldn't fully mature for years. I proposed a radical alternative to both kingdoms. Rather than fighting over the disputed territory, we would establish it as an independent trading zone governed by representatives from all three kingdoms. This would transform a source of perpetual conflict into a source of mutual prosperity. But it required each kingdom to surrender immediate territorial ambitions for long-term economic and strategic benefits. The negotiations took 18 months and required me to invest significant political capital with no guarantee of success. My advisors argued that the complex arrangement was unnecessarily elaborate when military victory could resolve the situation immediately. Many questioned whether I was losing my strategic edge by pursuing diplomatic solutions that required years to prove their value. But I had begun thinking in terms of strategic architecture rather than tactical victories. Individual battles determine immediate outcomes, but the structures you build during peaceful periods determine what conflicts are possible and how they can be resolved. By creating systems that aligned competing interests rather than simply overpowering opposition, I was building influence that would outlast any military campaign. The independent trading zone succeeded beyond my most optimistic projections. Within 5 years, it had become the most prosperous region in our area, generating wealth for all participating kingdoms while eliminating the strategic tensions that had caused decades of periodic warfare. More importantly, the collaborative model we developed became a template for resolving similar disputes throughout the region. 20 years later, this single initiative had transformed the entire political landscape. The collaborative frameworks we established had prevented dozens of potential conflicts and created a network of mutual dependencies that made large-scale warfare economically devastating for all participants. The strategic influence I gained from this success far exceeded what any military victory could have provided. This experience taught me that strategic patience isn't about waiting passively for opportunities. It's about working systematically toward objectives that require extended time horizons to achieve. The most powerful strategic positions often take years or decades to build, but they create advantages that competitors cannot easily replicate or counter. I learned to distinguish between immediate optimization and strategic optimization. Immediate optimization focuses on extracting maximum value from current situations. Strategic optimization focuses on creating situations that will provide maximum value over extended periods. The two approaches often require completely different choices and sacrifices. The key insight is that compound strategic effects often prove more valuable than linear tactical gains. When you build systems, relationships, and capabilities that improve over time, the eventual outcomes can far exceed what any single decisive action could accomplish. This requires enormous patience and confidence because the early phases often appear less impressive than conventional approaches. I developed specific practices for maintaining long-term strategic focus while managing immediate pressures. I learned to set intermediate milestones that provided evidence of progress toward distant objectives without requiring those objectives to be achieved quickly. This helped maintain motivation and political support during extended strategic developments. Also learned to identify which strategic investments would compound over time versus those that would simply provide one-time benefits. Relationships, reputation, systems, and capabilities that improve through use are fundamentally different from resources that diminish through consumption. Most importantly, I learned to balance immediate necessities with long-term vision. Strategic patience doesn't mean ignoring current needs or opportunities. It means ensuring that short-term choices support rather than undermine long-term objectives. Modern applications of long-term strategic thinking can transform career trajectories and competitive positioning. The people who achieve sustained excellence often sacrifice immediate gratification for strategic positioning that creates compound advantages over time. The ultimate goal is building strategic momentum that becomes self-reinforcing. When your long-term investments begin producing returns, those returns can fund even more ambitious long-term investments, creating an upward spiral of increasing strategic capability and influence. This requires accepting that true strategics domination is measured in decades rather than quarters, and that the most powerful victories are often those that create lasting change in competitive dynamics rather than simply determining immediate outcomes. This intricate chess set before me represents the culmination of my strategic education, the moment I learned to integrate every principle simultaneously rather than applying individual tactics in isolation. The carved pieces remind me of my final campaign, where success required orchestrating every element of strategic thinking in perfect coordination, like a master musician conducting a complex symphony. The challenge that tested my complete strategic development came when 3 enemy kingdoms formed an unprecedented alliance specifically designed to counter my individual strengths. They had studied my previous campaigns exhaustively and prepared coordinated responses to every principle I typically employed. Each enemy commander specialized in neutralizing different aspects of my strategic approach. The first commanded forces trained to counter my speed and positioning tactics. The second had built an intelligence network designed to penetrate my information advantages. The third had developed supply systems that made my resource efficiency principles less effective. Together, they presented a challenge that no single strategic approach could overcome. This campaign required me to integrate every principle I had learned into a seamless strategic whole rather than relying on any individual advantage. Self-knowledge had to inform intelligence gathering, which had to support positioning decisions, which had to coordinate with timing choices, all while maintaining adaptive flexibility and psychological pressure. I began by conducting the most comprehensive strategic assessment of my career, combining brutal self-evaluation with detailed enemy analysis and environmental understanding. This wasn't 3 separate activities. It was one integrated intelligence operation that examined all relationships and interdependencies between different factors. The positioning strategy I developed required coordinating multiple types of advantage simultaneously. Physical positioning had to support psychological positioning, which had to align with temporal positioning, all while maintaining strategic deception about my actual capabilities and intentions. Each element reinforced the others rather than operating independently. The alliance tactics involved building relationships at multiple levels with different objectives operating in parallel. Some alliances were designed for immediate tactical support, others for long-term strategic positioning, and still others for intelligence gathering and psychological influence. Managing these complex relationships required enormous attention to how each partnership affected all the others. Speed and timing decisions had to account for resource constraints, psychological factors, and adaptive requirements simultaneously. Moving too quickly would exhaust resources and alert enemies to our actual capabilities. Moving too slowly would allow them to coordinate their responses. The timing had to be perfect across multiple dimensions at once. The psychological warfare component required understanding how each enemy commander would interpret and respond to different signals, while ensuring that the psychological messages sent to one enemy didn't compromise our position with the others. Every action had to serve multiple psychological objectives simultaneously. Resource management became an exercise in optimization across competing priorities. Limited supplies had to support intelligence operations, positioning requirements, alliance building, and combat readiness. Every allocation decision affected multiple strategic objectives and had to be evaluated based on cumulative rather than individual impact. The breakthrough came when I stopped thinking about these as separate strategic principles and began seeing them as different aspects of a single strategic system. The question wasn't which principle to apply when, but how to align all principles toward the same ultimate objective. This integration required developing what I call strategic intuition, the ability to make complex decisions that serve multiple objectives without conscious analysis of every variable. Just as a master artisan no longer thinks about individual brushstrokes while creating a masterpiece, strategic mastery involves unconscious competence in coordinating multiple principles. Simultaneously, the campaign succeeded through this integration in ways that no individual tactical brilliance could have achieved. Each enemy found their prepared countermeasures ineffective because they had optimized against individual principles rather than integrated strategic thinking. They were fighting separate battles while I was conducting one coordinated campaign. Modern applications of integrated strategic thinking can transform competitive outcomes in any field. The people who achieve mastery aren't necessarily those who excel at individual skills, but those who can coordinate multiple capabilities seamlessly toward unified objectives. The goal isn't perfection in every individual principle, but fluency in how different principles support and amplify each other. This requires extensive practice in applying multiple approaches simultaneously until the integration becomes automatic rather than deliberate. The ultimate achievement is reaching a level where strategic thinking becomes as natural as breathing, where you automatically consider multiple dimensions of any competitive situation and instinctively choose approaches that serve multiple objectives simultaneously. This is the difference between knowing strategic principles and embodying strategic wisdom. This eternal flame burns before me as it has for over 2 millennia, tended by generations of students who have carried my principles into their own battles and passed them forward to future leaders. The fire represents the immortal nature of strategic wisdom, how the lessons learned in ancient conflicts continue to illuminate modern challenges and transform lives across centuries. As I reflect on the strategic journey we have traveled together, I am struck by the realization that you now possess the same fundamental understanding that guided emperors, generals, and leaders throughout history. The principles we have explored aren't merely theoretical concepts. They are practical tools that have shaped the destiny of nations and can shape the trajectory of your own life. The strategic sight you have developed allows you to see the invisible patterns that govern competitive dynamics in any environment. You understand that most people lose not because they lack talent or effort, but because they cannot see the deeper game being played around them. With this awareness, you will never again be surprised by others' success or confused by your own. Strategic position. Your mastery of self-knowledge provides the foundation for all strategic action. You know that honest assessment of your capabilities, motivations, and patterns enables you to choose strategies that align with your actual strengths, rather than your imagined ones. This self-awareness eliminates the self-deception that destroys more strategic plans than enemy action ever could. The intelligence-gathering capabilities you have learned transform uncertainty into advantage. You understand how to gather information about competitors' real motivations, decision-making patterns, and vulnerabilities. This knowledge allows you to predict responses and position yourself strategically rather than simply reacting to developments as they occur. Your understanding of positioning principles gives you the ability to control the conditions under which competition takes place. You know how to structure situations so that your strengths become relevant while your opponent's advantages become irrelevant. This is the essence of winning before the battle begins. The timing mastery you have developed allows you to align your actions with natural rhythms and create opportunities rather than simply waiting for them. You understand the patience required for strategic success and the decisive action required when moments of opportunity arrive. Your knowledge of strategic deception and psychological dynamics gives you influence over how others perceive competitive situations. You can guide opponents toward decisions that serve your strategic objectives while maintaining ethical standards and authentic relationships. The leadership and alliance principles you have learned enable you to multiply your individual capabilities through strategic relationships and unified action. You understand how to build trust, coordinate complex initiatives, and create value for others while advancing your own objectives. Your adaptive capabilities ensure that you can maintain strategic effectiveness even when conditions change dramatically. You possess the flexibility to modify approaches while preserving core objectives, making you resilient in volatile environments. But with these capabilities comes profound responsibility. Strategic domination isn't about destroying others or accumulating power for its own sake. True strategic excellence serves larger purposes and creates value that extends beyond individual victory. The greatest strategic leaders in history are remembered not for what they conquered, but for what they built and how they elevated those around them. I challenge you to apply these principles with wisdom, integrity, and concern for the broader consequences of your actions. Use your strategic capabilities to create opportunities for others, solve meaningful problems, and contribute to something larger than personal advancement. The ultimate victory is building a legacy that serves future generations rather than simply achieving immediate objectives. Your strategic education is beginning, not ending. These principles provide the foundation, but mastery comes through application, reflection, and continuous learning. Every competitive situation you face is an opportunity to refine your understanding and develop deeper strategic intuition. Start immediately. Identify one area of your life where you feel stuck or frustrated with your current results. Apply the principles we have discussed systematically. Conduct honest self-assessment. Gather intelligence about the real dynamics affecting your situation. Position yourself strategically and act with proper timing and psychological awareness. Most importantly, be patient with your development while maintaining urgency about application. Strategic mastery is measured in years and decades, not weeks and months. But every day you delay implementation is a day you remain vulnerable to competitors who are already applying these principles. The world needs strategic leaders who can see clearly, think systematically, and act with wisdom. Your generation faces challenges that require the kind of integrated strategic thinking we have explored together. The principles that guided ancient warriors can guide modern leaders in building better organizations, stronger communities, and more sustainable solutions to complex problems. The eternal flame will continue burning long after we are gone, but the light it provides must be carried forward by those who understand its value. You are now qualified to tend this flame and pass its wisdom to others who need strategic guidance. Begin today. The battlefield awaits, and victory belongs to those who combine ancient wisdom with modern application. Your strategic domination starts now.